So last time we spoke about the four-act structure, Kishu Tenketsu. Today we're going to talk about a much more widely known story structure for understanding or being able to write narrative stories, which is called the hero's journey. Okay, but before we go into that, because hero's journey, as opposed to Kisho Tenketsu, is a three-act structure. Okay, and because it's three acts, I would like to start off the whole thing with dialectics. So we mentioned in a previous video that dialectics is one of the earliest forms of attaining knowledge. It has to do with a very basic concept of that you have a thing, a thesis, in opposition with an antithesis to arrive at a synthesis of the two. So black, white, gray, or white, black, gray. So it's the idea that two opposites or two opposing things, the thing and the other, can be joined together to form a third that synthesizes the two. Okay? Now, dialectics was mainly the approach of the Socratic tradition. Later, of course, Plato wrote Socrates' ideas in dialogues. Okay? Between two people taking two different stands to try to arrive at a third synthesis. Okay, and it's also, I mean, you can already tell from dialogues, from the fact that ancient Greece was also a birthplace of the drama, in a sense. Something somehow links. Okay, it kind of comes from the same source, and if you notice, there are three aspects. You can kind of say introduction, body, conclusion. And conclusion, in a sense, which makes it also Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3. Okay, every kind of investigation into something kind of creates, is kind of understood through a beginning, middle, end kind of paradigm. And the idea with this is because, again, like in Kisho Tenketsu, we have kind of like a contradictory or opposing kind of two opposing things, like this kind of, this creates the drama, in a sense. That's how you have movement, that's how you have scene, story, all of that. It seems to me that this is the kind of the same root of our conception of what is the three-act structure. I'm going to simplify it more by going into what the hero's journey is. But to close on dialectics, so Hegel eventually took dialectics and formalized them, in a sense, as a way of, again, attaining knowledge. Understanding the nature of a thing is by seeing it with its opposite and trying to create an amalgamation, a synthesis of the two extremes. But later on, like way after Hegel, when critical theory arose, which was kind of a academic movement that rose in Europe mainly, then migrated to the US. So from Europe to US. Theodor Adorno, who was one of the critical theorists, in a sense, Adorno, Italian critical theorist, wrote a whole book called Negative Dialectics, where he tries to say, like, Hegel's formalization of this approach has many problems because history in itself is not as rational as we try to make it in this. Okay, and sometimes opposing one idea with another creates a tension that never arrives at a synthesis. Maybe sometimes shouldn't be. In his argument, he took the Holocaust as one of the examples of the atrocities of history, the irrational atrocities that makes this too simplistic, too idealistic. What he says makes sense in a way, and I'm gonna add on it in one thing is that rarely in life do you have like I mean, everything has its other. Everything has its other, okay? But the other of the thing can simply be the lack of the thing. That is its opposite. Here is where we come to algebra, okay? We have another video on this. But the thing is that this is constant, whereas this is variable. You know, constant. And in algebra, we try to understand what the variable is, and we denote it as x, okay? So algebra is one of the ancient sciences that makes you understand the variables in relation with constants. Alchemy is a way of understanding things through the interaction between constants and their variables, in a sense. Because with constants also we can understand them as being the elements, you know. Again, in Arabic, al-anasir al-jabriya. So it has to do with the idea of jabr, which I find as something related to constancy, الثوابت, the fixed things in this world. The sun comes up every day and goes down every day, you know. So these are fixed constants, the cycles of the sun, the cycles of the moon, the elements of the earth, you know. Water is water. It's a constant. Anyway, you get the point. So the idea is that dialectics has its flaws, some highlighted by Adorno, but here what I'm trying to say is like sometimes putting something as the counter of a thing does not necessarily, and synthesizing them does not bring you to extra knowledge. It might bring you to more like, you know, let's say two opposites are the Palestinians and the Israelis. Do we want to find a synthesis? Do we want to find a synthesis? Okay, not Israelis and Palestinians, a bully and the bullied. Do we want to create a synthesis between the two, or do we want the bully to know not to bully anymore, you know? Jabr. So just something to think about as a precursor to the hero's journey. Okay, so again, we said this is a 3-act structure based on the logic of beginning, middle, and end. Also, of course, rising action and tension and all of these things. The hero's journey, the term, was coined by American comparative mythologist called Joseph Campbell. So he coined this term. He also calls it the monomyth. So in all the mythologies he looked at, he saw that there was one underlying myth that rules them all, basically, which is this one. It's the story of someone who goes out of their comfort zone to an unknown world to attain something. And there's variations of this story throughout all of the world because it's somehow the story of the self, you know, of the self-actualizing. Which might end, you know, the actualizing might end in defeat. So there are tragedies here. It's not always a happy ending story, but somehow the hero is put in a confrontation with their other. It can be seen as a conflict-driven narrative, okay? Well, of course, like we said in Kisho Tenketsu, putting a contrast creates drama, creates action. Drama or action or movement. So let's dig into it. There are 3 acts, okay? Usually act 2 is the biggest in length. And act 1 and 3 are kind of the same. We understand it always as a kind of rising tension kind of thing like we did before. But the climax, most often than not, happens somewhere here in between these 2 acts. So the graph would look something like this. Move, highest point of tension, and then denouement. Okay, it goes down. The tension falls down. But what creates this point of tension is something called the inciting incident. Okay, or point of attack. something happens here that shifts the status quo, that creates a problem that needs to be solved in a sense. And all of this rise in tension is your hero trying to solve this problem. The highest point of tension usually is usually highest point of tension is usually the lowest point for the hero. It seems like all else is going to fail. It's the hardest moment. Here, the hero either prevails or doesn't, and your final act is basically about the result as it is the conclusion, what happens in the end. Could be an open ending. All of these apply to the 3-act structure. But the argument that I want to try to make is this structure cannot but be conflict driven, because without the inciting incident, you cannot have a story in a structure like this. Why? Because opposition drives the story. It's because there is act 1 that is like kind of the opposite. Sometimes people say act 2 is 2 times act 1 in length, should be. Okay? So somehow act 2 comes as a direct opposition of act 1. It comes like, if this is the black, this is the white, you know? So it comes kind of in opposition and to contrast something for it. So if this is the known world, this is the unknown world, until going back to the known world somehow. So the opposition happens here, okay? But starts off here. Many writers like to place the twist or the main rise in tension as the midpoint, somewhere here. And I think in people who structure like this, they try to bring it more towards Kisho Tenketsu, where maybe there doesn't have to be a real inciting incident, but before we get to the end, something happens to change, you know? I don't know, I'm speculating here. But this is the idea, is that it's 3 acts. There's a rise in tension that leads to a climax. And you can see, if we compare it with Kisho Tenketsu, the climax arrives here, where there it's act 4, the twist. But what I try to argue is that adding a 4th act kind of makes your structure more malleable. This is a difficult structure to work with somehow. Many people have adapted it in different ways. Like, for example, Shakespeare added an act before and an act after, making them 5 acts. Okay? Which is the same thing, kind of. And here, act 1. And you maintain the same kind of structure in a sense, but you can add a prologue and an epilogue, whatever you want to say it. Another way of simplifying it came through the hands of Dan Harmon, or the brain of Dan Harmon, who is one of the creators of Rick and Morty, the popular TV show. And he tried to simplify the hero's journey in a kind of circle structure that we talked about before, but we're hashing it out again. It's like a pizza or a pie or a cake that you divide into 8 acts. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 7, 8. And again, it goes in the kind of the same way. It's a very nice way to visualize it, because here you have the known world, and here you have the unknown. And he tried to take this journey from an external journey, usually understood as an external journey before, which is like Frodo and the Ring, and it happens exteriorly, like there's an actual journey. He tried to take this journey into a more interior journey, okay, where a character, let's say you, are in a comfort zone, in the main position that you're usually in, but you lack something, okay, there's a lack. And this lack creates a want. You want something, whatever it is. You want to be more powerful, you want to be more liked, you want to be richer, love of your life, you want to try to attain the love of your life, whatever it is, a want forces you to go, to cross the threshold from the known to the unknown, find what you're looking for through trials, tribulations, obstacles, all of these things. Take the thing that you're looking for. Usually it's kind of symbolized as the elixir. You find the elixir, you take the elixir. Also here, the lowest point, the highest point of tension. Okay, I'm just going to symbolize it like this. So lowest point for your character is the highest point of tension, but the character, you take what you want, but therefore lose something in return, and then return, just crossing the threshold back to the known with change, like having changed. Okay, so a very simplified hero's journey structure that shows you basically a normal self-actualizing story that anyone can relate to. You want something, you go do something unfamiliar to attain the thing that you want. Of course, you lose something in return. It's kind of like the karmic law of life, but it's also that you have to sacrifice to attain more things. And then you return to the original status quo, but having changed, like completely different. So this, in a sense, is the hero's journey story. But again, it feels like something about it is missing. And it feels like there's something about it that is very cyclical, you know? Kind of, again, to the same symbol of the snake that's biting the stone, very fat snake. Okay, there's kind of a loop. It keeps going because after you return to the initial point, you're gonna want something again and then go after this. All of this to show is that how Kisho Tenketsu is a story that supports a world, whereas this is a story that supports a protagonist. So it's about an individual most of the time. So you can say individual. So you can say, but no, there are many stories that are structured on a hero. Rick and Morty doesn't have one hero, right? There's Rick and there's Morty. Fine. But this story, like if you want to write a multi-protagonist or multi-POV story, film, book, whatever, you'll have to use this, but on all the characters and then interweave the stories. Kind of like Tolkien did in The Lord of the Rings, because Frodo is the main character, but at the same time, he divided the story from different POVs because they were in different places. So you do have an individual hero's journey for each one of the characters. 4-act structures, somehow, because they follow a kind of alchemical or natural order, tend to make it more collective somehow. And you can only understand this through putting this in practice. Like try writing a short film using this, and then try writing the same short film using Kisho Tenketsu, and you'll see the difference. Like you'll actually see it in practice. One other thing I want to say is when you go for 3, okay, so numerologically, 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, these are numbers associated usually with power and with the sky. Okay, sky or water, let's say, but they're odd numbers. So there's something about them that is not in tune with nature, like how we said 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 are more material numbers, down to earth, you know? So somehow there is something in talking about the world through narrative that seems more intuitive when you use an even structure. Maybe, we're speculating, I don't know. But the thing with the 3 is that, like, let's say we take these 3, the 4 stages, making it 3 kind of, to me, feels like it's just black, white, and red, which somehow is the colors of fascism. But, and like many, it's not only fascism, it's like, but they are powerful colors, you know, they're colors of somehow transformation. I remember the phoenix, you know, who goes through the same cycle every time, dies, then is reborn from the ashes. Somehow the story also of Dionysus, also Ra. These gods they were very powerful earthly gods somehow, but they had the story of death and rebirth all the time. Okay, so it's a death, rebirth kind of thing. I don't know if you're noticing, but already I'm starting to notice how adding the 4th final stage of gold helps one arrive at it in a different way somehow. Very hard to explain, but if we want to divide this in a 4-act structure, like if you want to, So if you want to divide this into acts, most writers would say that your act one would be here, act one. Whereas because two is double, this is act two. And this would be act three. Dividing it into four, I always see it like this. It becomes, you separate this chapter, which is six, which is funny, like six is a very material number, but it's also associated with power of the material. This becomes your twist. I've always heard the sentence, without conflict, there is no story. Apparently, there is. And I think for us seekers of truth, if we want to understand how to make the world less conflict driven, we should understand other ways of telling stories that do not rely on conflict. This makes the story much more fun, much more entertaining, much easier to watch because it works with very basic ideas. Remember the dialectics. One thing, it's other, and we put them together. Even if the together is the death of one or the other, the deletion. But somehow it feels like in this narrative, there's always one trying to fight another. It's like the hero's journey to make the unknown world known, like unifying these two opposites also. So, yeah. And ends in transformation, obviously. Yeah. Thank you.